Okay, the first thing I'm going to say to you tonight is that you shouldn't just believe everything I say. It's necessary for you to go back onto the internet and get the original sources and try and look at the information yourself, see what was actually going on. The more people that we have who look at the information, then the more information we pick up, because it's a kind of situation where the more you look, the more you find. Can I move this on to the first slide? How do I do this? Cool. In order to figure out how the towers were demolished, we first of all got to figure out how they were put together. And the easiest way of doing that is to look at this photograph, which shows quite well, without going into technical drawings, what went on. What we have is an outer perimeter structure consisting of 60 vertical columns per face, approximately 60. The dark band that we see, the dark vertical band that runs up the centre, is the core columns. There were 47 vertical core columns, roughly arranged in a 6x8 grid. It doesn't quite work out, but you're basically talking about 6 rows of 8 columns. Some rows only had 7. That was the main beef of the tower. In particular, the columns which ran around the outside of the core, and that would be column rows 5 and 10. They were the strong, hefty tower columns that held up a significant proportion of the weight. And if you're going to bring the towers down, then the place to attack has got to be the core, those core columns. And that is exactly what we did see. We move right back to the very beginning of the collapse. What I'm going to show you here is what we see here, I'm going to show you is 4 photographs, one after the other. In this particular one, keep your eye on the dark band on the antennae right at the very top, and you'll see that. You see that just beginning to move downwards. That's the first real movement we see, the first indication that the towers are beginning to collapse. And again, you see the antenna beginning to fall. The corner of the building hasn't actually moved down at this stage. So what we can tell from that is that the first element of the collapse was an attack on the core columns. All 47 core columns had to be severed, had to be disassociated in order for the tower antennae to begin to move downwards. This photograph was taken by Aman Zafar from his apartment across the river. And what it actually shows in WTC2, once the upper section, the walls and the perimeter columns had fallen to the ground, we still see a section of the core remaining. But what this shows us, that there was precisely that. It was a vertical severance of all 47 core columns. And you'll note that that's around about the 60th floor. That's well below the level of the aircraft impact. So we can't say that that severance was caused by the aircraft because it was in the wrong place. We can't say that that was the only severance of all the 47 core columns, but we know there was certainly one because we can actually see that. Now that is probably the most important photograph that was taken on 9/11 when we consider the order of the demise of the tower, how it collapsed. Because not only does it tell us that there was a horizontal disassociation, but if we look a little bit further into that and we do a dimensional analysis of what's left, we can see that this was not the entire core. All 47 core columns are not remaining in that picture. The outer core columns have been removed. Those core columns which were responsible for holding up the floor have gone. Column rows 5, 6, 9 and 10 were brought down at an early stage of the collapse. The weakest core columns, the ones in column rows 7 and 8, they stayed upright. It's also the common denominator between whether the towers fell, the columns fell, As a general rule, those columns which were situated adjacent to and accessible from inside the elevator shafts fell at an early stage of the collapse. Those columns which were remote from the elevator shafts and not accessible from the elevator shafts survived the early stages of the collapse. What we're going to look at now is the very early stages of the collapse. The tower on the left-hand side is just beginning to fall forward, and you can see the vague line where the upper section has tilted over. This photograph kicks a major hole in the official story. The 195 you see in the corner signifies the frame that it's taken from. We know that a video camera is around about 30 frames per second, so we're looking at 6.5 seconds into the collapse. And you see that the line, the lowest line of damage, is still at around about the 79th floor. The official story would have us believe that the collapse had progressed at this stage to something like 75 or 100 metres below that level, something like 20 stories. It would actually be off the bottom of the photograph. The official story relies on that progressive collapse, and what we can see here quite clearly is that that does not happen. What I'd like you to note on the next photograph I show you is that we see the expulsions beginning to move out as the collapse runs down the tower. What we've got to note in this, particularly with regard to the dust cloud expulsions, are 3 points. One is that they do not come out from every floor. The dust expulsions miss out a floor. Now you'd think if the tower was coming down one floor at a time, the dust and the expulsions would come out every floor. But that's not the case. They come out every third floor, which, if you look at the core columns, we know that all the core columns were welded every third floor. We also see in this photograph, it's more clear. On the left-hand face, we see two distinct areas. It's quite awkward to see, but if you go back and you look at the videos, you'll see that. You see two areas of expulsion. And you'll see that the corners are not involved. There's no expulsions coming from out the corners. So a pancake collapse or a truss failure theory, that kind of thing, we've got to ask the question, why are the corners not involved? The reason for that is that these core columns, the outer core columns, in rows 5, 6, 9 and 10, were taken down by concussive explosions placed adjacent to the welded column sections. Where the column sections were welded together, concussive explosions were placed adjacent to those, every 3 floors. And that's why we see the expulsions coming out every 3 floors. What would we expect to see? I'll just go back to that one for a second. What would we expect to see in the type of failure in the column? What would we see in the debris pile if that had been the case? If you look at the right-hand side, what you'll see is the lower column, the lower part of the column, subject to a concussive explosion, is going to have one face that's concave, bent in by that explosion. And as the column rips across the lower column, it's going to be held in place by the still intact welds, and you're going to see a concave face. So you're going to see opposite faces of the concave box column, opposite faces of the box column will be concave. On the other section, on the upper section, you see that as it comes across, that flange will be torn away, because the section's still welded, and as that weld tears, we will see the flange tearing away. So we would tend to look for exactly that kind of damage in the debris pile. And that's exactly what we see here. We see a box column. It is a core box column. It's an outer core box column. And we see one flange with its end torn away.